So let's look at class Anthozoa. So Anthozoas, these are going to contain the anemones and the corals. So let's first look at the anemones. So Anthozoa, because it contains corals and anemones, is obviously going to be the largest and most diverse class of cnidarians. All of these pretty much exist in the polyp stage. They really don't have medusa stages. So these are pretty much all polyps. So they have bodies that are basically cone-shaped, and you can see here, and you can see part down here. They're just a cone, but this cone is unique in that it's very thick-walled, very muscular. And on the inside, it does have mesoglia, but it's a very thick, muscly mesoglia. It's got that striated muscle in there. Remember that. So these can reproduce sexually via budding. Some species will produce, asexually via budding, and some can reproduce sexually. The ones that produce sexually are usually monoecious, they're usually both male and female, and they reproduce, they're viviparous, so they reproduce by essentially giving live birth. But some can do both. They can be sexual and asexual. So there you have it. Any which way you can. At the bottom of these is usually a pretty strong feature. We call this the basal disc. Basal meaning the base, or other petal disc. Petal being at your foot level. And that is simply a giant, it's like a cup. No easier way to put it. A giant muscle that grabs a hold to the substrate and keeps them in their spot. If they want to, they can let go. Now, some have actually been known to, quote unquote, swim. Which, if you watch the video I linked already right above these videos, you'll see in the video there's actually an example of one of these swimming out of the way of harm as a predator attacks it. But some have actually been known to migrate, which is actually very interesting for a for a class that is known for being sessile. So that's actually pretty cool. And again, beautiful, but don't touch them, because why? They'll sting you. Good, unless you're a clownfish, in which case they'll still sting you, but not as much. So the other half of the Anthozoas are the corals. Now, corals are extraordinarily diverse, and most of us know they play a huge role in most marine ecosystems. They can actually affect terrestrial systems as well. So morphologically, they're very similar to anemones, except for they secrete a shell that is made of calcium carbonate. And as they grow and secrete this shell, eventually when they die, the next generation will simply build on top of the old. And in doing so, after multiple generations, they stack up and get bigger, and they form a structure that we know as the coral reef. So coral reefs are very much alive. Coral is a living thing. It is essentially a very thin, a thin organism that lives on top of a hard shell. So coral polyps, they have a unique relationship with a photosynthetic dinoflagellate that's called zooxanthellae. That's going to be very important in just a little bit when we talk about coral bleaching. So because it's that zooxanthellae, that dinoflagellate is photosynthetic, that means they're limited on where they can live. So corals tend to only live in waters that are warmer and that are actually shallow, so they can get closer to sunlight, and the water needs to be clear so that the light can make it down, because remember, water will absorb sunlight. It's one of the properties of water. So as I mentioned earlier, they are a huge habitat. They form these giant reefs that are huge habitats for a stunning variety of marine life. So that's going to be very important, but also the reef itself will often act as a barrier between the rough seas and the shore, and helps create shorelines like beaches and estuaries where baby fish can grow and whatnot, and nurseries for other species of marine animals and plants. So their role in the ecosystem is actually very important, which is kind of a shame because we know that we're starting to lose them. And here's an example of that. So most of us kind of know what I'm getting at here. So here's Australia, Papua New Guinea. Over here we have New Zealand. There's Tasmania. And along this stretch of the coast of Australia is the Great Barrier Reef. The Great Barrier Reef it's visible from orbit. It is one of the it's considered to be one of the largest living organism on the planet because, again, coral is alive. Well, it used to be because of global warming and global climate change. Global climate change is actually what it's called. Global warming is how it's known in the media, but the actual term is global climate change. The shift in the water temperatures in this area of the around Australia it's risen a couple of degrees, just even sometimes just a fraction of a degree, maybe like a degree and a half. But that change in the water temperature, and that's average change, okay? That's not, it's just a degree and a half higher. It's just on average, it's higher. So the water can actually get much warmer than that. Because of that, whenever coral is stressed, whenever its environment changes and it puts stress on the organism, the response mechanism of coral is to, remember, it has that symbiotic relationship with that zooxanthellae. When it goes under stress, it expels the zooxanthellae. It literally kicks them out as a response to the stress from it just being too hot. Coral cannot live without this. They get a lot of their nutrients and energy from the photosynthetic zooxanthellae. It's a symbiotic relationship. They can't live without each other. So after, sometimes the zooxanthellae can return or remultiply if there's some left in there, and the coral calms back down if the water temperature gets back and everything, its chances of things will be good. But when the water temperature stays warm, essentially they keep the zooxanthellae out and the coral dies. And when the living part of the coral dies, all that's left is a white shell, the calcium carbonate shell that's left behind. Here's another good example. I know the closer view of the northern part of the Great Barrier Reef. So like 90% of this area of the Great Barrier Reef is dead. It's just dead. It's really sad, because this was once a thriving ecosystem with untold diversity, and because of the temperature change, it is now gone. We are losing it. They're trying to save and replant coral in some of those areas, but again, unless the water temperature stabilizes and returns to a normal that's suitable for them, then they can't live there. It wouldn't be a suitable environment for them anymore. So some of the people ask me, how do coral reefs actually form? And it's simple. Just in a shallow area of water, the coral can attach to a substrate. Then one of the things most of us know that. So like one of the things that I like to point on here is there are coral reefs in the middle of deep water, and people are like, well, how in the world did this just random coral reef just jet out of this deep water? And lots of times they form a structure called an atoll. So when I talk about coral reef formation, the example that I use is actually how an atoll is created. Here's a great example of an atoll. So essentially, underwater volcanoes will spring up from the ocean floor, and over eons of time will work their way up to the surface. And this could be up this could be up like a mile. From the bottom of the ocean to the top of the ocean. And all around is just deep water. So you basically have this giant underwater mountain. When the tip of the mountain pokes out, the area that's right around it is perfect environment for coral to take hold. And they will, and they do. But over time, most of those volcanoes go back to being dormant. And when they do, they slowly erode away and collapse as the caldera, the center of it, actually collapses. And that causes the island to collapse. But the coral reef actually holds on. And it has already affirmed its structure. And it creates a lagoon in the middle where the volcano has collapsed, and around it is an atoll reef. And yeah, here's an example of one. This was an old volcano that just collapsed in on itself. Got a deep blue ocean going down here, and all around it is coral reef now. And that's pretty cool, but that's how coral grows. You just need shallow water that's more, relatively considered tropical water, but not too hot, and it has to be clear, so that way the zooxanthellae can photosynthesize. That's essentially how that works. Now, this is some pictures of coral bleaching. There is a link. This is hyperlinked. If you want to click on it in your notes, not on the video, but in your notes you can click on it. And also, coral bleaching is linked in the video section of the notes. It's one of the listing, and it gives this is a document, essentially, a page that has a picture that gives some information on coral bleaching and explains the process. But this is when we say coral bleaching, this is why. Because when you bleach something, it becomes white. And so the whitening of the coral, as it expels the zooxanthellae and dies, it turns white. So we call it coral bleaching. And a lot of times when this happens, the ecosystem is losing its fundamental part. So the rest of essentially ecosystem collapse is ensured after that point. And lots of times other species, like this is an invasive patch of sea grasses that has moved in and is now covering the coral. So this ecosystem has completely been changed, and it's lost a lot of its biodiversity, which in ecological terms is never good. Higher diversity is always better than lower diversity, because it always gives the ecosystem an ability to adapt to stress more so than when there's lower diversity.